Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 FM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Cherokee land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. We're happy to bring you 3 segments on this week's show. First is Sean Swain, who hasn't been heard on the airwaves for a few weeks, followed by an anarchist from so-called Hamilton, Ontario, to talk about repression faced by queer folks and anarchists since Hamilton Pride was attacked by Nazis, and assess what's next. It should be noted that Cedar Hopperton was on hunger strike from their initial detention for about 5 days, and we're not really sure where that stands currently. You can keep up on how to offer solidarity and what's happening by visiting North-Shore.Info. Finally, we'll be airing Timothy Grieve-Carlson reading from the paper, quote, The Spectre and the Sovereign, The Problem of the Paranormal in Biopolitical Thought, unquote, presented on the Liberatory Horizons panel of the 2019 North American Anarchist Studies Network Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. If you're in the Asheville area on Friday, July 5th at 6:30 p.m. at Firestorm Books, Blue Ridge ABC will be showing a documentary, Lucio, about Lucio Ortuba, Spanish anarchist builder living in exile whose talent at forgery almost undermined the international credit system. Then on Sunday, July 6th, BRABC will be conducting its monthly political prisoner letter writing night, also at Firestorm from 5 to 7 p.m. We'll be providing names, addresses, and backstories of prisoners with upcoming birthdays, as well as the stationery and stamps you'll need. For a new weekly column on prisoner resistance news, you can check out Prison Break on itsgoingdown.org, which is authored by Certain Days Collective. Give a peek. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
After the 2016 election, a lot of us woke up to some harsh realities. In the aftermath of dark events, I came back to political work with a new sense of urgency. But after a few months of showing up to protest every weekend, I started to burn out. It didn't feel like anything was changing. In fact, maybe things were even getting worse. And it got me thinking, what comes next? Rebel Steps is a podcast about what comes next. You'll hear episodes on letter writing to political prisoners, practicing mutual aid, and creating political art. You'll hear the voices and stories of my community in New York City, spotlighting a range of organizers from the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, NYC Books Through Bars, Anarchist Black Cross, Lower Manhattan Food Not Bombs, brand workers, and more. I'll walk you through what you can do to start plugging into movements and learning organizing skills step by step. If you've been to a march or two and you're looking to jump in, this podcast is for you. Or if you have friends looking for more, pass it on. Listen at rebelsteps.com, on iTunes, or wherever you get your podcast.
First, some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a
I am currently hopped up on way too much coffee because today is commissary day. And according to my current agreement with the Final Straw, given past indiscretions when hopped up on said coffee, whenever I have had more than 4 cups, I have to read the following disclaimer. So here goes. The following segment does not necessarily reflect the opinions of this radio show, this station, the device through which you are hearing my voice, anyone with fewer than 4,000 pages of FBI files, or any person who may be mentioned or referenced, including bursts, and that blow-up dummy of me he dragged around to soccer games in Europe last year, and Noam Chomsky, who is still a douchebag. Can I say douchebag? Well, if not, you'll only hear me say bleep bag. And if you don't know what a bleep bag is, Noam Chomsky is useless, except for preventing yeast infections. So, with that disclaimer to the topic, I turned 50 in September. I remember a time not so long ago that people who were 50 were old. My parents were 50 once. They were old when they were 50. This upcoming birthday is like a benchmark, reaching a half-century point without getting whacked by anybody I've called out in public or challenged to wrestle me in cage matches. If I knew I was going to live this long, I would have eaten more kale and sniffed less model glue. So it goes. I ate cheese puffs and partied like Charlie Sheen, and now I'm sort of lazy and kind of stupid. But at this point in my life, I feel introspective, looking backward and looking forward. One major regret I have is not having any kids. You may recall that a while back I did a segment where I announced my willingness to procreate. Since I'm locked up, I proposed accomplishing this by artificial insemination. I would bring a Ziploc baggie of my reproductive fluids out to the visiting room, and the prospective mother of my kids would use a turkey baster to impregnate herself, probably on the bathroom floor, probably with the help of a friend with really heavy boots. So, as you may recall, I invited anyone interested to submit 500-word or less essays, and the Sean Swain Reproductive Committee would pick the winner. I used the word winner here loosely. Hard to think of someone naked on a prison bathroom floor with a cooking device shoved in her hoo-ha as a winner. Can I say hoo-ha? JWoww said it on the Jersey Shore all the time. Anyway, we had a winner. Ashley from Oakland. Ashley was a winner for a few reasons. First, she's from Oakland. And Oakland is a hotbed of radical resistance filled with savage cannibal maniacs of the dumpster fire variety. Shout out to friends in Oakland. Don't chew on any cops until you cook them. The second reason is, Ashley was the only applicant. No one else submitted an essay. I know, it's hard to believe. I know. I was expecting thousands of submissions, maybe millions. I mean, all things being equal, I think it's a desirable genetic specimen for purposes of procreation. As far as the standard checklist for survivability, I meet all minimum requirements. I have better than 20/20 vision. I have all my teeth and have only ever had 2 pinpoint cavities. I have no history of heart disease or cancer. And if I told you my IQ, you wouldn't believe me. My own mom said, get the f*** out of here. But she has a photo of me at the age of 5 sitting on the toilet reading a comic book. So that, of course, colors her perception of my brain capacity. Oh, I've also got an unusually large bladder and an incredibly strong urine stream. My bowel movements are quite regular. All of this, I think, makes me a fine specimen for reproduction. All things being equal, my kids would be healthy, big-bladdered, sharp-toothed, hawk-eyed little monsters unleashed on an unsuspecting hierarch world to wreak havoc and mayhem, chewing on the furniture and burning it down, sometimes on purpose, and sitting in the bushes with regular bowels. But alas, only Ashley from Oakland applied. Ashley was named the winner, again, using the term loosely. But before we could make arrangements for the Ziploc bag and the turkey baster, Ashley and I lost touch. She didn't respond. I think she left me. I thought about writing her and saying, but honey, what about the kids? Except I didn't want a restraining order. I think perhaps she didn't want to pursue the artificial process of the bathroom floor. Could be she wanted to procreate the old-fashioned way, by use of genital friction. I get that a lot. I suspect she only wanted me for my body and didn't respect my mind. I feel cheap, kind of used. So at any rate, my effort to engage in reproduction fell through, and I have yet to father any house pet chewing, mashed potato throwing savage cannibal swaniacs to lead the next generation in causing catastrophic systems to collapse. I'll be 50 in September, and I'm currently in exile in Virginia, which has a whole different visiting regimen. I think maybe I should try again and see if I can find a prospective mother to pump out a little swaniac or two. So consider this a call-out. If you're looking to deliver and raise a little swaniac, contact me directly by mail here at Buckingham, or write me an email via jpay.com. Optimally, I'm looking for someone who will give birth off the grid in a backyard pool rather than at a hospital, not get social security numbers for the offspring, and homeschool them in demolitions and target practice. But anyone will do. I imagine if you combine my genetics with anything plant or animal, you'll get something ridiculously disruptive. So, if you have an empty uterus and poor decision-making skills, hit me up and we'll ruin human evolution. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillon, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, 1349 Correctional Center Road, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org. So I'm speaking with an anarchist in Hamilton, Ontario, Would you care to introduce yourself for the audience anymore?
Yeah, thank you. My name's Tammy, and I'm an anarchist from Hamilton.
Awesome. We're going to talk about the repression that comrades have faced recently and ongoing from law enforcement. Before we get into the recent incitements, though, and incidents, could you give a brief description of like Hamilton and what the anarchist scene is like, and maybe a quick rundown of the Lock Street affair?
Yeah, certainly. So Hamilton is about a mid-sized city, one of the larger ones in Canada, but we have small cities of about 600,000 people. In terms of the anarchist scene here, it's fairly large and vibrant for our area. Got lots of different groups and projects and people that do work on a lot of stuff. There's lots of like pipeline organizing that gets done here, things around anti-gentrification, feminist and queer issues. We have a anarchist social center, the Tower, that does a lot through there and things like that. In terms of the Lock Street affair, last year we organized an anarchist book fair in March. And during the weekend of the book fair, there was like a Saturday night demo that took place against gentrification, a march that went down one of the more affluent streets in the city that have sort of been put forward, the kind of the model of what Hamilton wants the city to be. And a few different businesses and things had their windows smashed and some property destruction happened. I think the figure thrown around was like $150,000 in damage, but it's never really clear the specifics. Following it, city of Hamilton dealt with it very dramatically, for lack of a better term. It became sort of a huge outcry in the city. City Hall tried to have the anarchists labeled as terrorists, tried to have the Circle A designated as a hate symbol. There was stories in local media about anarchists hiding in bushes and parks, so the city went around and cut down bushes and parks just in case. So sort of dealt with a large city backlash. At the same time, the far right, where we live, really jumped on this as an opportunity to organize. So following the events, they organized a march down Lock Street, which was essentially like a far-right march that was supposed to show solidarity with local businesses and get lots of people to come out. So they went and visited the one donut shop that had been targeted that Justin Trudeau ate a donut at the following week. It was sort of weird. And then beyond that, they really targeted anarchists in the city. So at our social space, the Tower, we had our space attacked a couple times. We had the windows smashed. It got broken into and trashed. A few other nights or sort of other small damage. One point, we had like a bunch of them show up and a bit of a confrontation. A fight broke out in front of the space, and it sort of got ongoing like death threats and bombing threats and stuff like that for the space. So eventually got evicted and had to move, but ended up in a much nicer space. So that was good. And then in terms of the broader sort of city response was kind of mixed beyond sort of the like city council and the police and the right, sort of deal with lots of debate sort of around violence and property destruction, kind of the standard things that happen. And then the police in the city really cracked down hard, specifically focusing on known anarchists in the city. So they raided like known anarchist collective house and eventually like came to arrest a bunch of the people that lived there. And then in the end, like 7 people faced various charges, most of which are sort of in their process of coming to an end now. Some folks are on probation, some are finishing a conditional sentence, someone was on parole, all that sort of thing.
And can you talk about what happened with Hamilton Pride this year and who were the homophobes who showed up and attacked people?
Yeah. So at Hamilton Pride this year, so the Pride is sort of an interesting thing. So for several years, the Pride Committee made a choice. So it's no longer like a march or a demonstration or anything like that in the city. Unfortunately, it's actually just like a event that takes place in Gage Park, which is a large park downtown. They sort of have performances and booths and speakers and whatever, but basically it's just a large park event. And this year at Pride, there was like a large group of far-right folks who showed up, sort of a combination of Christian fundamentalists, neo-Nazis, some local sort of like alt-right folks and yellow vesters. And they had shown up with large, like ginormous, like 6 to 8 foot signs that they bring with sort of different things, like talking about people needing to repent for their sins and mentioning Jesus and a lot of random things like that. So a couple weeks previous to that, the same group had attacked Pride at Dunville, which is a smaller city, about an hour outside of Hamilton. So there was sort of the idea that folks might try to do that in Hamilton. So some people got together to sort of strategize and come up with a plan for how to deal with that. So one group of folks constructed a sort of large, really large black barrier that would just sort of block them from being seen from the Pride events and keep them out. They showed up immediately, were really aggressive, screaming just a lot of like horrible, like homophobic, racist, everything you can think of sort of slurs and insults, made jokes about rape and violence, and very quickly everything sort of like came to actually erupt in violence. They sort of tried to take down the barrier that was keeping them from being seen in Pride, and basically very quickly a brawl broke out between a bunch of them and a handful of Pride participants who were there trying to challenge them for entering in, and then many more Pride participants actually came to join in as that was going on.
This is the Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts. You're hearing Tammy, a Hamilton anarchist, talking about the attack on Hamilton Pride by Nazis and the after-attack by police against queers and anarchists. More info can be found at North-Shore.Info. Besides that cops are the enemies of free people, why have cops involved themselves in the events of Pride at all, let alone coming after radical queer folks in the aftermath, like coming to arrest them and harass them? They weren't invited, right? They were like disinvited from Pride?
Right. So actually, generally, the disinviting of cops from Pride in Hamilton has been kind of like controversial, or a thing that's been pretty debated and there's not large agreement on. I think moving forward, there's going to be much less of a debate on that. But this year, they wanted to have a recruitment booth at the Pride celebrations. Eventually, they were told that they couldn't have a recruitment booth or whatever, so couldn't have a recruitment booth. They weren't actually like told that they couldn't be there by the official organizers of Pride, just that they couldn't have a recruitment booth. Like the Pride committee who organizes it, like met with the police beforehand about possible like concerns or whatnot, and still works with them. They just didn't want them to have a recruitment booth. And then the day that brawl broke out, basically it erupted between two groups of people. The cops stayed on the perimeter of the park during the whole thing and like didn't intervene. Eventually, when sort of the fight broke down, they came after, first just trying to harass some of the folks, some of the queers who were masked up so they couldn't be identified by the right to take off their masks and to move and stuff. People didn't do, and then eventually they just escorted the far right folks out of the park. In the following sort of time since Pride, in which the police have come under a lot of backlash, I don't think we should be arguing, obviously, for cops to do more or be involved, but definitely like a lot of the sort of queer community here, and Pride as an official organization is taking that stance and have been asking, why they didn't do anything. And the general response by the police has been that basically, well, you didn't invite us, so what could you expect? Which is not went over particularly well to them. I think that response has made people quite angry.
So can you talk about like the after effect a little more of coming after queer folks? Like there have been arrests since the actual events of Pride in Hamilton, right?
Yeah, totally. So following the events of Pride, there was generally a really large sort of public outcry in the city and beyond. There was a lot of video that was taken specifically by some of the right folks that are pretty awful, that sees the fight take place. Like some of them had like weapons, and some of them like were quite vicious, like in the fight. And sort of a lot of that footage had went around, and people were really, really disturbed by it, and were making a lot of calls for the police to do something to act on the attacks that happened in Pride before action started to happen. Definitely some like anarchist leading folks in the city were trying to have conversations about, why maybe relying on the police to do that weren't such a good idea, or how, those calls can sometimes turn out different than you think. And Sure enough, the calls for the police to take action on the events of Pride has resulted so far in them exclusively targeting queer anarchists in the city. So starting last week, they started to harass people at their houses, following them around town, block them in their driveways, all those sort of creepy things that cops do, and have slowly started to arrest folks that they claim were involved in sort of the counter exchange of being at Pride to defend it from the far-right folks who were attacking it. And so far to this date, there's 2 people who have been arrested. One is currently in jail. One was arrested but was released with an appearance to appear at court. We have confirmation of one more arrest warrant and a person that's working out turning themselves in for that. And there's a lot of sort of talk the police continue to make of more arrests being imminent. So it's uncertain what that'll mean. They definitely have been facing a lot of backlash for how they've dealt with it so far.
Does it seem like, and it's okay if you don't want to make guesswork on this, but does it seem like the fact that they're coming after queer folks that were being attacked by Nazis who were taking anti-police stances, at least vocally, or who are from communities like anarchist communities or radical queer communities that would take anti-police stances, does it seem like they're being gone after because the Nazis are like utilizing the police and filing charges? Like I've seen that happen in the U.S. at some places where the Nazis will attack people or get in a fight, and then they have no qualms about trying to get their buddies in blue to come after the people that they couldn't get in the streets.
Yes to all of the things you said, actually. So the first part, in terms of who they're targeting, it definitely seems to be very intentional. So they started off by targeting not only known anarchists in the city, but anarchists in the city who had also been charged in relation to the events at Locke Street last year. So I think very obvious seemed to be that one of the strategies that they were thinking they could pursue was to start arresting these people, whether or not they were there or involved, and make the argument that actually this whole problem is just, remember, it's just these like violent anarchists, you don't like them anyways, and try to frame it that way. But that definitely very quickly did not work for them. And generally from the first arrest that they made, the public, all the backlash in media has generally been very, very negative. And the first person that they arrested on the weekend, Cedar, someone who is very outspoken against the police, again, was one of the folks charged in relation to Locke Street things that wasn't even present at the Pride events that happened a couple weekends ago. And now there's just sort of this confusion that's going on in the city, or seems to be the police are just sort of going in circles. So they've like publicly claimed in multiple statements that, yes, Cedar was arrested because they were there, and they have identified them as video as being there. Since making that statement, lots of folks have come out saying that they weren't there, that there was no way Cedar was there, including like a local ex-city councillor who's now running for like parliament, folks involved in sort of the more like organized NGO queer community in Hamilton. So really a large spectrum of people have came out against that claim. And now there's sort of rumors that maybe that's not the reason the police are actually charging this person, but because actually of a speech they made at City Hall following the events that happened on Pride, in which they spoke critically about queers having a relationship with police and outlined why queers shouldn't trust police to keep them safe. So that's kind of going on in that element. And then in terms of sort of the far right going with charges, I mean, for sure, they've definitely, like following everything, started to like dox people online that they would guess were there, trying to show video, sharing people's personal information. They mentioned a lot about contacting the police with evidence and trying to get people arrested, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, anarchists in the city haven't done that. And one of the things that we found out recently, which is sort of a heartening thing, is that actually of the probably 150 people or so who actually ended up being in and around that confrontation that took place, not a single person has come forward to the police as either a victim or a witness. I think demonstrating already a distrust that existed between the queer community and the police, and now has even gotten worse. But in response to the backlash police are facing, one of the big arguments that they're making now is they can't focus on arresting sort of the neo-Nazis and the fascists because people on the other side aren't coming forward. So it's actually not their fault, but it's because people aren't doing that, despite the fact that there's, lots of video and other evidence if they were so inclined to arrest those folks.
You mentioned like the argument that the police were making, and this article, one of the more recent articles that's up on North-Shore.Info, which is a really great site, mentions like false narratives being passed around even by like supporters of Cedar who were saying, yeah, they were there, but they were justified in being there in the first place. Is that like a thing that y'all have had, or that folks have had any success in countering as a narrative, since it's just flatly false?
Right. Yeah, totally. So I think that has changed since then. There's been a lot of shifting, but even in countering that sort of false narrative, there's been a lot of emphasis on the fact that people's like initial impulse of like, you can't actually see a lot of the people are masked, so you don't know who's there, and to like, defend someone if they were there being justified and shouldn't be arrested, to like absolutely be the right impulse. And like, it makes sense that people are doing that. And, if and when additional people who were actually there continue to get arrested, that is still totally justifiable and people should stand behind them. However, in this case, that just, is absolutely untrue for this person and sort of speaks more to the specific targeting that the police have been doing. And since then, definitely folks have been, like apologizing or like, oh, I didn't know that. I said that, I want to defend them because they're there, but now I know that they're not there. And actually that's even more fucked. So very quickly, actually, people have sort of switched to that like general narrative. And that has happened as more and more people have like come forth, like as mentioned previously, like in the media and different statements actually saying that they were there and Cedar was not. So I think that's really taking over as the more general thing that people are talking about.
So you mentioned kind of a backlash, at least in the media and among the general population, against the police for these activities, and the support or a lack of pushback against Nazi activities, which is tantamount to support. Can you talk about what local authorities or so-called authorities have done in response to the police activities? Like I've heard the mayors rather themselves a couple times, and also how the mainstream media has been dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything about everyone's response has been a really pleasant surprise for a lot of the folks closely impacted. So everyone targeted so far and the folks involved were all the same people who, again, previously were charged last year in relation to Lock Street things, in which generally public opinion and media was like really, really hostile. And this time around, even as the police try to use that as sort of a scapegoat or something to draw away attention, has really been the complete opposite. So the mayor has done, it seems everyone has done, in positions of authority, have done a really poor job of dealing with these things. And I imagine if they have a PR employee somewhere, they just keep banging their head against their desk, being like, oh God, why did you say that?
Facepalm.
But yeah, I've just really been doing a bad job. So the mayor of Hamilton has largely refused to comment on what's been going on. But one of the few comments he did give was to say that the violence that happened was basically the fault of the Pride Committee for not letting the police have a recruitment table at the event.
That's inane.
So people haven't really taken very kindly to that. And likewise, most of the police sort of excuses or narratives saying that they couldn't be there because they weren't invited. People are like, that's bullshit. And as they talk about, they're trying to arrest other people, they just can't. People, again, are just like, that's bullshit. They see a lot of the videos and all the stuff that's happening, and particularly a few of the people who were very involved in the confrontation that happened in Pride and were involved with several people getting injured, went on last weekend to do the same thing at Pride in Toronto. And again, there's actually like a lot of video of these people, attacking people, beating them, etc. So as more and more happens, it's becoming harder to publicly justify why that's happening. And then in terms of the media, I've never seen so much media critical of the police for as long as I've lived in the city, and probably any place I've lived. It's generally all of the articles, like mainstream news sources and like TV news seems to be really critical of the police, critical on how things are going moving forward, and just everyone basically being like, really, this is what you're doing? And they just sort of keep really putting their heels down to just like reiterate and affirm their position, which is just, I think, getting more and more criticism directed towards them. And I think what we're seeing more and more, like different members of the queer community here, groups and things that previously, you know, I would be much more familiar with talking about probably like the need or value working with police, are coming out and just saying there's clearly no reason why the queer community should trust the police. This is just proving that that is the case. Of course, no one's going to come forward to them because the police don't care about them. And that has really just like taken over actually as a really big sort of point in discussion in the city.
This is the Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts. You're hearing Tammy, a Hamilton anarchist, talking about the attack on Hamilton Pride by Nazis and the after-attack by police against queers and anarchists. More info can be found at North-Shore.Info. Most pride committees tend to be rather liberal, to say the least.
Yeah.
And reactionary in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, to even be in dialogue, just to reiterate the history of pride being or starting off with mostly trans women of color participating in a running street battle for multiple days in New York in the late 1960s.
Yeah.
After the police tried to raid their space. But like, how has the Hamilton Pride organizers been reacting? Are they on the same boat of people who are aghast at the activities of the police and pushing back against authorities in this way, or kind of just being quiet?
Yeah, I mean, so there's actually been a huge shift with them that has been seen. So previously, like your description of like being quite liberal, like definitely is the case. And they moved from like a march to having it in the park in the past. There's been different conversations about sort of, you know, having gentrifying real estate, people like tabling and then wanting to exclude overtly political groups to not be controversial. So generally Pride in Hamilton is really sort of lean towards a liberal attempt to be sort of more apolitical. People have always contested that, but definitely that's been the general sort of stance. However, as things have changed since the last Pride, more and more from the first statement after Pride, the committee did release a statement about what happened that was pretty mediocre and not particularly like critical or anything. But since then, as things have progressed, more and more they've started to release statements that are quite the opposite. And just today, there was a newspaper article published by one of the folks very high up in the Pride Committee, just decrying the role of the police and calling them out for saying that Pride didn't try to work with them, outlining that they did try, that they wanted to work with them, but that they were being vindictive because of the recruitment table, and just that they can't be trusted. They haven't done anything to keep their communities safe. And it really actually, I'd say in a week, really moved to actually a very critical police stance, which they definitely did not have previous to the events at Hamilton Pride this year.
That's awesome. That's a start, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously like moments of like repression and targeting and things like that are unfortunate, but also they often come with the territory of being involved in radical politics. So if that can happen and also be useful and push things in a good direction, I think that's just a really great thing to see.
It sounded like before you had said that the violence that had happened in Toronto that had just happened a couple of days after Hamilton was after another Pride event, or did I mishear?
That before Toronto there was another Pride event?
No, in Toronto, the viral video from the mall, because I'm going to ask a question about that, and I want to not. Right,
yeah. So the same group had attacked. I mean, so they've been sort of traveling around to like different prides like around the country. Ones I'm most familiar with have been sort of the last three they've done in a row. So I mentioned Danville, which was a small city sort of outside of Hamilton. Then they did Hamilton, and then they went on to do Toronto, which is the video you're mentioning, and that is, again, the same people.
Because the video also, or the post up on North-Shore.Info also describes it as being a pegida video or Pegida rally. So I was wondering if you had any commentary on the fact that, like you mentioned, yellow vests, and they seem to be a mostly right-wing instance in so-called Canada, and there was a Pegida rally. What's up with all these spin-offs of European far-right movements? Or not even that. Gilets jaunes is not specifically far-right, but in Canada it seems to be.
One of the more sympathetic looks, although I have no sympathy for these people, is you like talk to them or like follow the things that they're saying, of just being like really totally confused, and like, you know, show like a few people who are involved in the yellow vests would show up at Pride and be like, you know, I'm not homophobic, but like I'm here to support these people because they're in line with me, and I just don't think Pride should happen, but I'm not homophobic. And then, you know, start talking about things like Sharia law in Canada that is just ridiculous, and clearly just like really confused about a lot of things. I think in terms of the growth of those things in Canada, and elsewhere, it's a really unfortunate thing where I think people's lives and living conditions and things that they're facing are like getting worse and worse, and people have really sincere grievances for the life that they're living and the bullshit that they have to come up with. Unfortunately, instead of, you know, seeing who the real perpetrators are behind that, capitalism, those in power, etc., fall victim to sort of easy explanations that like actually what's making their lives bad is it's like just the queers, or it's just the refugees, or it's just the women. So people have these frustrations that are real, but just get directed at completely the wrong audiences, and just get further and further radicalized and further more violent.
So for listeners who are they're not in Ontario, they're not nearby, and they want to offer some help to folks up in Hamilton that are dealing with these terrible circumstances, are there any fundraisers? Are there any ways to like go to your local Canadian consulate and protest, or what would you suggest would be some good ways of showing solidarity?
Yeah, totally. So there's a couple things. So this will probably be too soon, but this Friday we are calling for like an autonomous day of action. But we will be calling even after Friday for folks who feel inclined to continue to take action where they live. And that could look like anything from rallies to demonstrations to banner drops, other more creative things if people are so inclined. We're asking folks to do that and to send photos or descriptions, if they can, to either the tower at riseup.net or to post it themselves at North-Shore. So that's a big thing. I think we're so far doing all right for fundraising. We start to do some of that locally. If folks are interested in helping that way, could just send an email transfer to the tower, or through our PayPal account would be another way to do it. But I think we're really pushing more for folks to take solidarity actions where they are and just continue to sort of build the pressure that's been happening around this stuff.
Sort of off topic. As someone in so-called Canada, so I'm hoping, although it might not happen, to put this conversation alongside of a conversation with Kanahu's Freedom to talk about resistance to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I'm wondering if, as someone who's living in so-called Canada, there's this like really creepy love affair that a lot of American liberals have with. But I'm wondering if there's anything that you can say, your opinion, as far as being someone in a settler colonial state who's in a community organizing against the pipelines and in solidarity with Indigenous folks. Do you have any words that you want to share to the Prime Minister about approving the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or to folks that are resisting it?
I wouldn't have any words for him, but I think the idea that Canada is somehow more benevolent and progressive is just definitely not true. The image that Justin Trudeau puts forward is obviously image and just that, and doesn't have any substance. So, you know, he can give a very empty speech about caring about Indigenous rights and talk about reconciliation or whatever the you know, at the same time that he's pushing forward pipelines that are going against like various protest camps that are trying to fight them, and going against various Indigenous communities that are trying to fight for that. I mean, it's just, that's not how it goes here at all, unfortunately.
Well, are there any good ways for folks to keep up on what's going on in Hamilton moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the good ways would be going to North-Shore North-Shore.Info, so sort of local counter-info website. We have a lot of stuff that's up there. If folks do Facebook and that sort of thing, the Tower Facebook page usually has very up-to-date things and are sharing a lot of what's going on.
Are there any things that we didn't talk about that you want to touch on while we're still on the phone?
I don't know how much this fits in this conversation, but I feel like there's this one thing where, so last year we faced a lot of repression, and this year kind of some of the same people are facing it again, and we've got a lot of sort of really nice, support and people like reaching out to say that like, I hope you're okay, this is really shitty, whatnot. And it is shitty, but out of last year's repression, we got a new space that was better than our last space. And in the end, like a lot of the things we did in the city only grew stronger and had more people involved and ended up stronger afterwards. And even this is happening, it's unpleasant, it sucks to always have to deal with this bullshit, but it's already leading in a direction that actually we can pull strength from. And I just think sometimes keeping that in mind when you're in sort of the midst of like the bullshit of repression, that like you can get strength from it, and there's other things that you do have agency over is like a good thing to keep in mind or something.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you so much for having this chat, and much solidarity to you and yours.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing it.
Besides Cedar, 4 other people, including the one mentioned in the interview today, have been arrested, and they are collectively known as the Pride Defenders. If you enjoyed this episode of Final Straw, please consider becoming a Patreon sustainer, or buying some merchandise from us, or making a one-time monetary donation. You can find out how at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org/donate. Thank you very much. This is The Final Straw Radio, and I'm Bursts. You're hearing Timothy Grieve-Carlson reading their paper, The Spectre and the Sovereign, The Problem of the Paranormal in Biopolitical Thought, presented at the 2019 North American Anarchist Studies Network Conference in Atlanta, Georgia.
Hello, everybody. So in the paper that I'm going to read today, I'll be advancing an argument that what we call the modern disciplinary or biopolitical state is dependent on the denial, exclusion, and isolation of beliefs and practices that are not necessarily materialist in their metaphysic or ontology. So I'm going to talk about paranormal or magical beliefs and practices. The 2 examples that I'm going to use are ghosts and UFOs. I chose those examples because neither of them are particularly valuable cultural objects in the kind of cultural world we live in right now. So rather than try to interpret, speak for, or appropriate a traditional or a traditional practice that I'm not a part of and can't speak for, I chose 2 that are kind of funny to us, basically. And so rather than try to critique the metaphysics from the outside, I'm sort of trying to do it from within. So I hope that makes sense, this paper. And as I read, I encourage you to kind of think about your own paranormal or magical beliefs, practices, experiences, and think about how those might fit into the argument that I'm using today. This paper starts with a ghost story. During a period of several days in 1996, the St. Louis Police Department received no less than 10 phone calls from a young couple living in an old Victorian house on Imperial Drive. Their complaint was consistent. Someone was in their home. They could hear this person walking on the 2nd floor when they were downstairs, and when they were upstairs, the intruder seemed to stomp through the 1st floor with impunity. But when the couple rushed to meet their home invader, there was no one to be found. There were signs that someone had been there. Cupboards were open, objects had been thrown on the floor, doors and windows were ajar, but they never spotted the ninja-like invader. Jefferson County Sheriff Corporal Rich Rice responded to 2 of the calls and neither found nor heard anything. But the calls from the young couple persisted, and their obvious distress, coupled with their otherwise down-to-earth demeanor, made Corporal Rice hesitate to dismiss them entirely. Rice returned a 3rd time, when they reported that the security system had detected an intruder through the back door, which was left open. There were objects strewn on the floor when Rice entered, and the door was left ajar as the young couple found it. But there were no footprints at all in the fresh snow through the backyard, as though the intruder had simply opened the sliding glass door and vanished, or took off into the sky. As Rice sat down to interview the couple for the 3rd time, he was understandably very skeptical, and no doubt aggravated at the waste of his department's time. That's when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone walking across the 2nd floor of the home. The 3 embodied persons present rushed upstairs to investigate, but only one of them was surprised to find the 2nd floor empty. I've been a cop for 27 years, and even talking about it now gives me the chills, Rice told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I'm not a believer in ghosts, and this was enough that it gave me the heebie-jeebies. I'm a Missourian, he said. You gotta show me. Unless I see a goblin walking across the floor, I think things are explainable. But this was not explainable. It was like something out of The Exorcist. I do not share that story as an argument for the reality of spirits or any form of discarnate intelligence, but as an instance of how such a belief in the spectral and the paranormal and the transcendent can become a problem for the implementation of governance and law in biopolitical regimes. With the brief time that I have today, I want to suggest that the paranormal, not only the spectral and the ghostly, but any phenomena, entity, or practice that is not accepted by contemporary materials paradigms of critical theory or the sciences, has historically represented a major problem for the implementation of governance, not only in theory, but in the practice of the governance of population that Foucault refers to as biopolitics, or the government of the living. I am not arguing that the paranormal must be uncritically accepted as a class of phenomena. Rather, conceptually, as a matter of belief and practice in the day-to-day lived experience of people in their environment, the paranormal subverts, destabilizes, and, as we will see, possibly precludes the possibility of a government of the living. As such, modern governments have engaged in extensive attempts to exclude, isolate, and deny paranormal beliefs and experiences. The figure of the spectre has a long history in critical theory, following Marx's original attempt to channel the specters haunting Europe in 1848. Other phantoms float by in the works of major 20th century theorists, and Freud's work on mourning and the uncanny, and Benjamin's essay on the concept of history, and most prominently in Derrida's 1993 book, Spectres of Marx. Throughout these works and others, there has been an indelible tension between the ghost and the governed, the poltergeist and the population. Derrida playfully coined this form of spectral thinking hauntology as a way to refer to philosophical concern with the being of non-being, the presence of absence, and the trauma of historical and personal memory. Derrida's hauntology has taken off as a term of art not only in philosophy, but throughout critical and aesthetic thought in the 21st century. None of the theorists above would have come anywhere near the possibility of real specters. Freud famously excommunicated Jung from psychoanalysis for his interest in the occult, and Marx would have considered such beliefs even more degraded and dangerous opiates than Christianity. Rather, hauntology uses the image of the ghost to show how material existence implies non-existence, and how even non-existences can take on a subtle but unyielding form, and how these forms can function as historical agents in the lives of real people. In 2015, the history of religion scholar and critical theorist Bruce Lincoln and the sociologist Martha Lincoln published an article entitled Toward a Critical Hauntology, Bare Afterlife and the Ghosts of Bashu. In the article, the Lincolns rehearsed some of the literatures that I have laid out above before turning to two ethnographic accounts by Mylan Gustafson and Hionit Kwan of contemporary belief in place-bound ghosts in Vietnam. Of these two authors, the Lincolns write, in contrast to the hauntological texts that we have previously discussed, these authors employ an unnervingly naturalistic idiom in their accounts of ghosts. Ghosts appear as fully extant and active animate beings that confront the living in direct, non-mediated, and even menacing fashion. The Lincoln positioned these Vietnamese accounts to the field of hauntology by designating them as primary hauntings, in relation to the subject of ordinary hauntology, so the kind of metaphorical speaking I described above, which they call secondary hauntings. While the specters of ordinary hauntology, such as the specter of communism, Marx, memories of childhood abuse, and historical trauma, are quite real and demand attention, they remain essentially discursive, only appearing to those witnesses with eyes to see them. It goes without saying, the specters of Marx and Derrida are metaphors. The hauntings of Bashu, by contrast, are still discursive, but they seem to be accompanied by phenomena. They reach out and grab them. They possess the bodies of unworried passerby and speak in languages that those bodies never learn. They cause cars to skid off the road near the places where they died, and they appear to tourists and other onlookers with no cultural framework or memory of the historical atrocities that they represent. Without the space to detail the unnerving accounts that Gustafson and Kwan described, I will simply state that these kind of hauntings that play in contemporary Vietnam are much more like the account of Corporal Rice with which I opened. They involve real people, they are accounts of real events, and, in both cases, they represent a yawning demand for a justice that the state cannot provide. In the contemporary Vietnamese accounts, it is understood that the discarnate presence of a dead person is much more likely following a bad death, an execution in the street, a public massacre, or at the hands of an invading imperial force like the Americans or the French. In the case of the house on Imperial Avenue in the St. Louis Dispatch, There is the repeated demand from the young couple that the police must somehow protect them, as though a ghost was a criminal or a presence without a body could be placed in handcuffs. I hope it is clear that this comparison, of course, is in no way meant to trivialize the colonial atrocities that took place in Vietnam or compare the essentially nonviolent plight of that unnamed couple with the unimaginable suffering of the Vietnamese. Rather, I compare these two cases in support of the claim made by Derrida in 1993 that to speak of hauntings, and I would add here whether they are primary or secondary hauntings in the Lincoln's terminology, is almost always to speak of some form of resistance, the bleeding edge of governmentality, a metaphoric representation of the limits of control, the demand of the unquiet dead for revenge, as was the case in Hamlet, the shattering of some rule of the norm or some resetting of historical wrongs, or of the ability of governments to administer protection to the populations that they would control. And they appear with or without governments to ignore them. With this perspective in mind, I want to turn to the work of the political theorists Alexander Wendt and Raymond Duval in their 2008 essay, Sovereignty and the UFO. In this essay, Wendt and Duval advanced a deceptively simple point. Quote, modern sovereignty is anthropocentric, constituted and organized by reference to human beings alone, end quote. While nearly every other aspect of modern sovereignty is contested by theorists, the authors write, modern political systems almost universally consider sovereignty to be a praxis and phenomena that is exclusive to the species Homo sapiens. Now, while this seems rather obvious within contemporary political theory, the authors note that this has not always been the case. In traditional societies and pre-modern governments have recognized a variety of non-human sovereign assemblages. Distressed farmers in middle America today can only look to the government for assistance when an unstable climate threatens their livelihoods, but in traditional societies it would be a decidedly non-human and discarnate sovereign assemblage who would either bestow or withhold the boon of a spring rain. Nowhere is the anthropocentric nature of modern governments more obvious, suggest Wendt and Duval, than in the modern UFO phenomenon. It is important here to clarify what I mean precisely when I say modern UFO phenomenon. While anomalous aerial phenomena have been described in religious terms for nearly the duration of recorded human history, the modern UFO phenomenon begins in 1947 when a cargo pilot assisting a military search and rescue operation named Kenneth Arnold observed a fleet of crescent-shaped objects over Mount Rainier in Washington state. Arnold described their motion as bouncing, something like a fish flipping out of water, or a saucer skipped over a body of water like a flat rock. Newspapers at the time coined the objects flying saucers, mistaking Arnold's description of their motion for the shape of the objects, which were in fact shaped more like a weird croissant. Thus, the phrase flying saucer was born and the modern age of the UFO began. Arnold's sighting, which occurred while he was assisting a military operation, was immediately treated as a matter of military concern. It's important to note here that the modern UFO phenomenon was gestated and born as the child of American Cold War anxieties. In the proxy war fought in the propagandist arena of the space race, any strange object in American skies conjured fears of not just alien, but Soviet eyes looking down on us. It was also the golden age of American science fiction, and UFO reports were quickly conflated with the idea of human-like extraterrestrial biological entities from other planets. Ken Arnold, however, would later suggest that he had not observed a spacecraft, or even a machine of any kind. The objects pulsed with light like a ghostly heartbeat, he said, and they skipped along as though under the power of wing beats, and they gave him what he described as, quote, an eerie feeling. In a later interview, Ken Arnold's daughter, Kim, would admit that her father did not believe he had witnessed spacecraft. Rather, he believed he had seen some kind of flock of living creatures, and he had the impression that these creatures came from the place where humans go when they die. So it wasn't exactly the plot of Close Encounters that started the UFO phenomenon. As mentioned earlier, strange objects in the sky have always appeared to human beings who tend to understand them in religious terms, Ken Arnold included, but the sudden and dramatic appearance of such objects in the cultural climate of America in the 1940s and 50s led to an exaggerated War of the Worlds style cultural plot where apparitions that used to be called gods or spirits of the dead became hostile communists from Mars. Now, it's important to highlight this cultural myth in contrast to Arnold's belief for two reasons. First, to dispel the association with what is called the UFO phenomena with belief in extraterrestrial spacecraft visiting Earth. Second, to reinforce the fact that we truly, definitionally, do not know what UFOs are. Historically, traditional societies and eyewitnesses have described them in essentially religious terms, as non-human and transcendent intelligences to be feared and respected. Now here's where things will start to get weird. Wendt and Duval point out that both modern materialist science and the state, as realist institutions, cannot concern themselves with that which cannot be established empirically. Following Kant, the same is true for the social sciences and critical theory. It is not only that Marx disdained religious and metaphysical ideas for their oppressive potentials as systems of domination, rather, in a structurally paradoxical fashion that suggests something like a Mobius strip with no sides, you can't talk about that which does not exist. In the case of the state, the appearance of that which does not exist constitutes an existential threat to legitimacy. As Wendt and Duval put it, there is a UFO taboo because the UFO exceeds governmentality. However, this taboo is not strictly due to the empirically unverified nature of UFOs. As pointed out above, the authors argue that it's the anthropocentric metaphysics of the modern biopolitical state that essentially precludes governments from openly asking questions like, do UFOs exist? And if so, what are they? As Foucault describes in texts like Discipline and Punish and in his lectures during the 1970s at the College de France, the modern era is marked by a shift in governments towards disciplinary power rather than sovereign power. Disciplinary states operate through biopolitical regulations that work directly on the bodies of living people. In this day-to-day operation of governments, populations are controlled and regulated in the careful organization and routinization of their daily lives. This is opposed to pre-modern sovereign states in which a centralized political authority, usually a monarch or emperor claiming some kind of religious or transcendent mandate, wields a unitary government through the threat of violent physical force. This disguising process of the law wearing the mask of the norm was essential for the preservation of power during the period that Foucault calls the threshold of modernity. Why? Let me offer a general and tactical reason that seems self-evident, Foucault writes. Power is tolerable only on the condition that it masks some part of itself. Its success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms. There are moments in the lives of any biopolitical state, however, when disciplinary power fails and the old sword of the sovereign must be drawn out. Judicial and extrajudicial executions, states of emergency, and states of martial law. These periods in which ordinary checks on government power are suspended are referred to as states of exception, a concept derived from the work of Carl Schmitt, but fully developed in the work of Giorgio Agamben. Any time the state displays its authority to kill represents a state of exception. And I would suggest certain privileged individuals in America can decide a state of exception today by just choosing to call on the increasingly militarized police. These moments in the otherwise regularized life in the modern state represent a choice. In a given situation, a governing body is called upon to decide the exception to the norm, in the words of Carl Schmitt. The profound point made by Wendt and Duval in their essay is that the UFO phenomenon, being fundamentally resistant to the anthropocentric assumptions in the prevailing metaphysical model of the state, refuses the state's authority to decide the exception. To put it very, very simply, for a modern biopolitical regime to even acknowledge the possibility of a non-human power that it could not compel with regulation or threaten with extermination would fundamentally challenge such a state's claim to legitimacy. This is why modern governments have so consistently denied not only the existence of UFOs, but the existence of even programs to study such phenomena. The case is the same with the now widely substantiated military research into the applications of psi phenomena that took place in the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Governments publicly deny not only interest, but the existence of such phenomena, while frantically pursuing private research into their nature and military applications. Indeed, based here on the work of the Lincolns, Wendt and Duval, I would argue that the paranormal represents such a severe conceptual challenge to the modern anthropocentric state that such beliefs and practices essentially preclude the praxis of modern governments. So long as the paranormal represents a class of phenomena that the state cannot attempt to regulate, control, or threaten with extermination, the paranormal will be inherently anarchic. Before I wrap up, I would like to return to the story with which I opened the couple in the old Victorian on Imperial Ave in St. Louis. Each time that the presence in their home became too obvious to ignore, so much so that they must have felt unsafe, they made a choice to decide the exception. They called the cops. They did so more than 10 times. Each time, however, the police either failed to recognize the problem or, in the case of Corporal Rice's dramatic admission, they simply admitted failure. And not just failure, but frustration, confusion, and fear. Whatever was in that old Victorian home that ran across floors, slammed doors, and flung plates out of cupboards refused the state's authority to decide the exception, and thus marked a clear limit of control for the modern state. Again, I should be clear, I am not arguing that ghosts are real and that they are anarchists. Rather, I am suggesting that belief in the paranormal as a collection of concepts, ghosts, UFOs, psychical phenomena, and others, point out a subtle weakness in the edifice of the contemporary apparatus of modern governance by exposing a dimension in the lived reality of human beings that the state cannot hope to regulate. In conclusion, I want to briefly dwell on a single line from Foucault's Discipline and Punish. In describing the emerging disciplinary praxis of the modern world, he points out that these practices generated a certain kind of body, a human understanding of the body that was new to the modern world. Quote, "This new body was a natural body," he writes, "a body manipulated by authority rather than imbued with animal spirits." End quote. When Foucault refers to animal spirits, he was referring to the early modern physiology of Descartes, in which a very fine substance called the animal spirits pervaded all animate forms, translating will into action, thought into motion, and in human beings permeating the body with what Descartes called a soul. It is the soul and in the animal spirits that channel it that disciplinary regimes and regulatory apparatuses cannot access, work upon, or control. To put it very simply, Foucault is referring here to a quality that we might call a number of different things: soul or spirit, some essential quality that is neither body nor mind but encompasses them both in the whole. It is a subtle but unyielding dimension of human life, the worldly experience that cannot be disciplined or regulated, and thus must be systematically excluded, isolated, and ultimately denied in the new biopolitical regime. It is the spirit and accompanying phenomena that suggest the existence of such a spirit that represents such a great existential threat to the apparatus of state control. Thank you.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.